with the main body of the webinar shortly. Okay, so you should all have just seen a note pop up saying the webinar is going to be recorded. So if you know anybody who you work with that was unable to attend today, then do feel free to share the recording. You should receive an email in the next couple of days with a link to the recording of the event. We'll also be sharing that on our social media channels. So do spread the word widely if you'd like to, and feel free to share with any teaching and learning colleagues at your university. Right, bear with me a moment, I would just share my screen. Can everybody see that? Wonderful. Right, so welcome to our webinar. The theme today is Innovating Effectively in Higher Education, and I'm delighted to have an extremely experienced panel with us today to share their views on this topic. Just a couple of quick notes. So obviously, if you're here, that's great. I'm hoping you'll be able to see and hear myself and a couple of my colleagues and also our panel today. If you've got any networking apps open on your computer, you might want to turn them off just temporarily so that you get the best experience from the webinar. The session, as I've mentioned already, is going to be recorded. And we would really like you to interact with the panel. So you won't be able to turn your own videos on or speak today, but we would really love you to put your questions to our panel in the second half of the webinar. So please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to put those questions. Leanne Deman is going to be chairing the discussion for us today, and we'll be happy to put those questions to our panelists for you. There's also a feature which you should be able to see where you can upvote the questions. So if you see that somebody else has asked a question and you think, oh, that's a great question, I'd really like to know the answer to that, then you should be able to flag that as something that you'd like to float to the top of the question box. And we also have the chat box active, so if you'd like to put any comments in there, feel free. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to my colleague Laura Pacey, who is our head of publishing for Open University Press, and she's going to do some brief introductions to our panel for you today.
Thanks, Bryony, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's my great pleasure today to introduce the first in a series of webinars focused on teaching and learning. The pandemic has brought new challenges to higher education, certainly, but in many ways, has it just acted as a catalyst in the evolution of education delivery that would have happened anyway? Hopefully, many of you are already aware of the book Achieving Teaching Excellence from Peter Wollstonecroft, Leanne Domain, and Paul Kashtian that published last year with Open University Press, which took the TEF as its starting point and then used wide-ranging case studies to examine innovative teaching strategies and how to overcome the many challenges facing students and instructors. This webinar follows on from this with a panel, as Bryony mentioned, of very experienced educators who will be discussing the trials and tribulations of teaching staff in higher education over the last year, with a focus on introducing innovation. Chairing the panel discussion is the wonderful Leanne Domain, who is Associate Dean at De Montfort University, and our illustrious speakers are Peter Wollstonecroft, Programme Leader for Postgraduate Courses at Liverpool John Moores, David Parks, Director of Library and Learning Services at De Montfort, and Alex Connick, Fellow in Management Practice at Said Business School and Senior Lecturer at Liverpool Business School. I know I'm really excited to hear about some of the real life examples of where things have gone well, and perhaps not so well. And so without further ado, I'll pass over to Leanne.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Bryony. So what we're planning to do today is to share the ideas of David, Peter and Alex, and then there'll be plenty of opportunities for questions. So I'm not going to provide any more update at this stage, just to hand over to David, if that's okay, who is going to share some of his ideas around innovation in education.
Great, many thanks, Leanne, and thanks everyone for inviting me today. It's great to see so many people here. Well, what a year it's been. Incredible, this massive shift to online learning that we've all been involved in, we've all embraced, and we've all sort of dove into with ingenuity, imagination, with an incredible experience over that last year. But I feel, for me at least, the last year, I'm just looking at that photograph of me there with a tie. I've forgotten how to tie a tie. I haven't been used to dressing like that for the last year. So just in terms of our culture, our approach to learning, it's been a real opportunity for us to reflect and see how it's been for us, feel how it's been for students. And I think it's been a mixed bag. We've used this ingenuity, this imagination, and great collaboration, collegiate approaches right across the sector, right across universities. But I feel, for me, that we've been let down by our virtual learning environments. I think we've had virtual learning environments for 20 plus years now. And unlike media, broadcasting, gaming industry, they haven't really developed in that time. Those other industries have had to develop to remain relevant. VLEs haven't, and I think they've let us down over this last year. And I'll just go into why I think probably some of that is. They don't allow for that flexibility. They don't allow for that human contact, which is so important in the digital realm. They don't allow for that personalization. They don't allow for that creativity, that urge to create, that community of practice that we need to have, that community of learners. And I think we can explore some of that as we go forward. Digital and ed tech is often given to us as a solution to a problem. And my view is that education isn't a problem to be solved. Education is a process to get involved in. It's a process. Technology can't save us, is the clarion call. It can contribute to us, but oftentimes it doesn't. And our challenge, I think, over this next year and how we move into this new blended world, the accelerant that COVID has brought, is to adopt it and adapt it and make it much more human and human-centered. And we can explore that in the conversation, hopefully. But I'll move on. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that, David. Yes, I think there'll be quite a few questions about that as we go on. Peter, I just thought that maybe you might be able to share some of your ideas.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating listening to both Laura and David talk, and Laura talking about how, in many ways, things have been accelerated by the pandemic, and David's view of the human side. And I think if we look back just over a year ago, there was this mad rush to go online, and very little thought was paid to the pedagogy. It was very much based on the processes and very much based on systems. And what we were in effect trying to do was to transfer what we were doing in the classroom online. And for me, that's entirely the wrong approach to take. It was completely understandable at the time because there was high degrees of panic, of course, and we were desperately trying to make sure that the student experience stayed a positive one. But instead of trying something new, we just tried to take what we had in the classroom and put it online. I was laughing at David's comment about sort of a tie and a tie, and it is the case that it's very rare now to actually have maybe sort of formal work clothes in place. And I think for me, the key thing, whether it's online or whether it's face-to-face, is to build a community. And so all of the things that I'll be talking about today are about that community of learning and working together. Quite ironically, my experience has been that the community amongst staff and community amongst academics has really been strengthened. We're seeing things like record numbers of attendees at staff meetings. We're seeing, I'm getting to know everybody simply by little sort of Teams calls, which replicate maybe corridor conversations. But for the students, we've almost come across a very formulaic approach. And I'm just going to use breakout rooms as an example. And what I'm not saying is the breakout rooms are the source of everything that's wrong about the world today or about education today. But I am saying about it's one of the ways in which we're trying to build a community, but maybe doing it in an incorrect way. As you all know, breakout rooms are very much a staple of online teaching. It's become slightly formulaic, the way we use them. A lecture, sharing of knowledge, and then students are allocated randomly into breakout rooms and expected to discuss what they've learned. And of course, to a certain extent, there's logic in there. We do this in the classroom all the time. You know, go into your groups, chat about a case study, feedback. It's a very normal approach. However, the problem, of course, is that by physically removing people from the main room, by telling them to go into a breakout room, it almost becomes a scientific experiment. I'm always imagining some sort of cognitive psychologists sort of looking at these, and 4 or 5 people are put into a room, and what happens? And of course, what generally happens is that there's silence, cameras are off, and there's very little in terms of interaction. So what happened is, certainly from my experiences, that people grew to dislike breakout rooms, especially those at level 4 and level 7, who are new to the university and often never actually met their tutors and never actually met their fellow students. And of course, by simply putting them in a breakout room, you are almost like forcing a community on them rather than allowing it to evolve in a far more natural way. So I think my message, and I'm sure we'll discuss this in the questions a little bit more when we look at the solutions, is that what we shouldn't do is simply replicate what's in the classroom. We should come up with new solutions. And secondly, in many ways, they should be student-led rather than staff telling people what to do.
Thank you, Peter. I think we've all got our experiences to share around the use of breakout rooms over the last year, and there's been a number of articles written. I know that yourself and Lucy did, based on your experience at Liverpool John Moores. Yeah, I'm sure that we'll certainly have some questions about that. Alex, was there anything that you wanted to add, your thoughts at this point? You're just on mute, Alex, at the moment.
Sorry, there you go, the ultimate incompetence, the universal and ultimate incompetence that we've all had. What I thought about what Peter said was fascinating, was the idea of taking the community that we have in the classroom, but finding new ways of putting it online. And I think we're sort of a way down the line on that, but we're not quite there. One interesting point is that at Oxford, when we've started to come back, or to creep back, and we certainly did in December, and then we sort of are again now, what we discovered is that the Zoom chat, for example, is one element of the online experience which is probably going to transcend the COVID crisis. And what we're all trying to figure out is how to maintain that second line of communication, the kind of radio phone in at the same time as the radio program, and to run that twin track type of education approach simultaneously. There's a really interesting thing is I experienced in my career as I came from industry, and back in 2007 was the very beginning of the kind of online video revolution. And I ran the company that won the contract from the government to create a channel called Teachers TV, whose purpose was to create thousands of videos to help educate teachers around the country. And we actually got a couple of things right and a couple of things wrong, and they all kind of presaged what came next. So the things that we got right were that we went for very short, very punchy programs, rich, highly informative, but very short programs, kind of 5 to 15 minutes. And I think that's been borne out by all our experience in putting together course materials over the last couple of years in terms of what works and what doesn't on Canvas and so forth. What we got wrong was that we didn't sort of foresee the social media revolution that would come to sort of take over online video and make things like platforms like Instagram do so well, which is that two-way communication. And so we didn't really put that in the Teachers TV. And don't forget that that was the point when Blockbuster didn't buy Netflix because they thought it'd be a waste of their money. Blockbuster soon after went bust. So we made thousands of videos, but we didn't have that second stream channel of communication, that social digital social interaction, which I think we've all subsequently discovered is possibly the most powerful dimension of being online. So I think there's plenty to learn. I think that, from the last year, I agree with Peter and David, that we've got some things wrong. Some of the kind of technology is a bit clunky, but we probably won't go back to where we were before. We probably will end up with some kind of hybrid.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot for that. I think one of the key things actually may form the first point to discuss actually is the role of social media. And I know that, you know, at De Montfort we've been speaking to students and they've been telling us that they'd like us to use more social media to help us engage them with their learning. And I guess it's sort of the ultimate form of tech, and where do we draw that line between what's, you know, a sort of scholarly platform and what is that more immersive platform. I must admit, I myself sometimes feel like a bit of a dinosaur when the students are making suggestions about using TikTok or Insta or Snapchat, and, you know, I've got none of those. And actually, you know, our students telling us that they want things in a more bite-sized, more sort of transactional format. And I just wondered whether any of you had any thoughts about social media as a tool for learning, and is there a place for that, and how might we use that?
I think it's a really interesting point, and actually it also goes to the heart of how we communicate with students. And I think I take on board absolutely what Alex was saying about we won't go back to where we were before, but there is a danger here, and I think we need to look at communication with students. There is an assumption with social media that there's almost instantaneous responses, whereas traditionally we've said we use email, you would expect an answer within 48 hours, but with a lot of the more modern platform, and especially when we use social media, there's an expectation that we are maybe more on call. And I think it's about managing expectations amongst students if we do use social media. I'd also go back to my other point that it's important not to force it. If we say to students, you know, you must use this particular social media, I think it loses that sort of organic appeal, and, you know, we don't have that community approach.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Peter there. I think the challenge is that we have to teach at scale. So we have to, you know, and social media is very personalized, very sort of individualized approach. And how do you scale that up? How do you do it at that kind of scale? I was looking at the use of Teams, for example, which has grown exponentially over the last year. Microsoft Teams, something like 200 million students are now using Teams, but they don't have their individual identities recognized there. There isn't that way to personalize or individualize that experience. And maybe there's something around the further use of AI and learning analytics and way of personalizing technology to enable that. Students don't bring their social media identity into the platforms that we use at university. And that's a real challenge, I think, for us, is how we successfully do that. Should we do that? And can we do it at scale?
Yeah, I think there's the problem that we've got is that there isn't really a default social media platform for the education space in the way that there is for almost every other space. So the workspace probably has kind of Slack, I guess Teams, although it's very clunky, Teams, as I'm sure everyone would agree. You know, LinkedIn potentially, the social space is TikTok, Snapchat, and so forth. But there isn't really that elegant equivalent for the education space. And I'm certainly on quite a lot of the courses I do. There's always that bit at the beginning where everyone's trying to feel their way to how are we going to run the informal communication here? Are we going to use WhatsApp? Are we going to use Teams? How are we going to and you often end up with multiple platforms, and that doesn't really work. So I think there's probably a business opportunity there somewhere for somebody to really define that second channel of education that I think is probably here to stay, but hasn't yet been codified into one solid space.
Absolutely. In fact, Sue Force has mentioned this in the chat around that perhaps we don't use the full functionality of our VLEs, and actually we use them more of a dumping ground. And I just wondered, David, because you mentioned earlier about having a more human-centered approach. I mean, are there ways that you think we could use the tech that we've got already to achieve this, or are we looking for a different solution?
We can probably bend the technology in some respects, I guess. I mean, learning is obviously, it's a complex human interaction, and, you know, it requires deep thinking, cultivation of ideas, a high tolerance for ambiguity and that kind of unknowing as well. And how we can bring that into the technology that we use is probably by giving students more ownership of it.
Thank you. I mean, we know that the pandemic Laura mentioned it at the beginning, actually, it's created a pretty seismic shift in how we do things, and you know, has arguably brought what we were planning to do over the next 10 years forward to try and deal with in the next, you know, or have dealt with to some extent in the last 12 months. I mean, what does this mean for us in terms of the design of our courses and programs in the future? What, you know, what's that sort of fast evolution going to look like? Alex, I wondered if you got any.
Yeah, no, I think if you invented a sort of a university sector from scratch now in the 2020s, it probably wouldn't have the faculty structure that universities had, let's say, in the 1960s, or, you know, whatever the pivotal moment when the sort of pillars of most universities were built. So you wouldn't have a computer science faculty standing alone from all the other faculties that are using computer science. You wouldn't say have a media faculty on one side of the university and a business one on the opposite side. You might combine faculties from medicine and business, or engineering and business, or engineering, computer science, media technology, and so forth. So I think course development is probably at its most kind of sexy at the moment when you're going cross faculty. And I think that's probably going to continue in the 2020s. So, you know, if I think of the courses that I've recently written that have kind of been approved, they were all cross faculty. So video production meets business, for example, or fashion design meets digital marketing, or sport meets digital marketing. And you can say that those are kind of sort of exotic outliers, if you like, but actually they're not. They're very core to the actual economy that's out there. Because, say, if you take the north of England, where Peter and I are based, the really big economic players now are the kind of big e-commerce companies, and those are exactly the kind of mixed scale skill sets that they're actually looking for from their graduate intakes. So we need to be probably retooling the way universities are actually built, or almost in the faculty structure, to make sure that we're teaching the modern world as it actually is. And then the second point I'd make is that the sort of grant chasing, we need to interface with industry because we need 300 grand's worth of grant, which is kind of a cynical take, but also a true take on a lot of the way universities think about their interface with business, probably needs to segue into a much more embedded university business sort of coalescing. So if you take the way Stanford handle it, for example, you see a much tighter integration between academic research and the startup world of Menlo Park, California. And I think that a few British universities are starting down that road, but we're nowhere near as far down it as the Americans are. And we probably need to start thinking about careers in universities and the private sector where you can kind of have an indoor and an outdoor, and you can be a revolving sort of career pattern like they do in Stanford, where superstar academics can 1 minute be in a startup and the next minute be teaching a lecture, and that's kind of acceptable. And that's a very different take on industrial liaison and industry partnerships than the sort of rather acronym obsessed world of just applying for grants and then trying to get some of the industry to come up with some figures that kind of provide matching funds. Is that too cynical? I don't know.
I don't think so. I think it's you know, now is the time for us to be having these conversations. Now's the opportunity. We have the opportunity to. I think. Peter, David, did you want to add anything to that?
I think Alex's observation is really, really good. The ed tech industry is worth about $77 billion a year. It's massive. It's a huge sort of turnover, and there's huge opportunities there to get involved and share some of that around, I think, in the sector. The challenge, I think, is that the technology has amplified some of the digital divide. We've seen that happen, particularly at my university, where students, it's not only about the devices that they have access to, but the whole infrastructure from broadband and Wi-Fi technologies to where students are situated as well within the digital landscape. And so we need to reflect this in the pedagogy as well and think about how we're situated. What is our role in the digital landscape and that kind of thing. There's a huge amount of research there, I think, that we can explore and that should feed back into the pedagogy, into the teaching as well. So I think that's a really interesting thread to pull out there, and I think we should explore that more.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating. I'll absolutely echo what David's saying. There's a couple of fascinating points in the chat from Mark and from Wayne as well. And I think there is danger here of taking a one-size-fits-all approach. And Alex talked about the idea that we've got these quite rigid faculty structures in place, and they date from the year dot. And in actual fact, we should sort of maybe knock down this and create something a little bit more fluid, really. And I think it's the same for students. We've got to be really careful that we don't view them as students. We view them as individuals. So in actual fact, you have some who are not digital natives in any way, shape or form. You've got others whose maybe home life is not conducive to having a camera on and participating in that way. And you've got others who are absolutely massively keen about digital learning. So I think the way I see universities of the future are things which are less bureaucratic and hopefully more responsive for the needs of students.
Suzanne's made that point quite well in the chat, actually, about how we make this assumption that students are tech savvy. You know, we call them digital natives, but are they really? You know, what we have found is that students don't always use the technology in the most appropriate way. And, you know, that's something as well that's mentioned in the chat there by Wayne, and about how students don't use social media in an appropriate way, and you know why we've had to develop all these sort of policies around appropriate behaviour on social media, that very transactional nature. I mean, what do you think we need to do as educators to manage the student expectations, and what do you think we need to do to upskill our students in how they engage in EdTech for learning?
Shall I jump in there? Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting. When you teach a course, you often find yourself scratching your head as to how do I communicate with everyone? And then you find out that there's been a WhatsApp group for that course since 2 days before the course even started. And there was already a perfectly good channel to reach everybody, just that you weren't part of it. I think if we're going to critique students for misusing social media, we should probably take note of the fact there are plenty of academics who misuse social media too. And there's a whole class of academics who seem to do nothing but sit on Twitter slagging everybody off, and I think that probably needs to be stopped as well, or at least toned down a bit like the BBC have done, because it comes across as quite hypocritical. I think there are certain Rosetta Stone type subjects at the moment which we probably ought to be trying to teach everyone about digital. And Peter mentioned very accurately that not everyone knows digital, and not everyone certainly knows coding. I've certainly been spending a lot of time looking at artificial intelligence recently, and I would actually venture that's one of those subjects that probably should be featured in almost every course now in university. You know, whether it was library services or medicine or edtech or digital marketing or defense or cyber or security. You know, it's one of those subjects that's so pervasive. In fact, it's been described by lots of luminaries, including the last week's US National Intelligence Report, as the new electricity. And I think we probably need to be trying to take our student bodies forward in knowledge of those Rosetta Stone subjects, such that they can grapple with any other academic subject as it becomes relevant in the 2020s, particularly as they go into industry, where almost every career will at some level, from space to local government, have some kind of AI component. So I do come back to my point that I think we need to sort of reinvent the architecture of how we conceived some of our courses in light of the digital experience, not only of the last year, but also of the coming of a very real AI revolution that's taking place all around us.
Thank you. I think one of the things that's come up quite a few times, Lena's mentioned it in the chat, about how we ask students to engage with lots of different platforms. And actually, one of the things that we discovered quite early in the pandemic was that we were trying to create a lot of variety, because perhaps, you know, there was this perception that innovation was what was needed. But actually, students were saying, stop this complexity. We don't want to have lots of different platforms and lots of different forms of tech to engage with. You know, the complexity really should be in the conversations, in the delivery, in the debate, and not in the technology used. And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts about that. Should we really be looking at simplifying the platforms that we use rather than adding additional complexity or innovation?
I would argue absolutely yes. I think Suzanne's made the very valid point that she tells her students that they're there to learn the subject rather than the technology, and that's exactly what it should be. And I think we need to look at this. It also brings to mind about what our role is as well. Is our role to make sure that our students have got the digital skills needed, or is our role to take away barriers and make life as simple as possible? And I don't know what the answer is, but I know that within my university, we're looking at this and looking to see how we prepare students in September. And one of the key things is to simplify things. And I don't know if that's the right way of going about it, but it does mean that hopefully we can focus on the content and focus on the curriculum and the pedagogy rather than anything technical.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Peter. I think one of the key things is teaching people about the digital world in which we're all situated. So we have to think about our situation, the psychogeography of where we're learning as well. So we need to think about that and situate ourselves in that. So we need to be aware of algorithms that are taking place. For example, we need to be aware of privacy, deep fakes, and that whole sort of digital capability kind of thing as well. And that needs to be part of our pedagogy. Social media is a part of that, and the role that we all have in feeding into that. And I think that's about that digital citizenship and about that sort of contribution that we can make to the wider discourse that goes beyond discipline, but also explores what the internet means for us as learners, as citizens, and so on. And I think that's a key element to any kind of online engagement.
I think there's another thing to say, Leanne, which is that not only should we be flexing the sort of the technology at our disposition and also the way faculties interface with each other, but we have to probably think about the way we conceive of education at all. Because we're also delivering essentially a 3 or 4 year degree course akin to what we might have been delivering in the 1960s in a very changed world. And my observation is that people are much more open now to lifelong learning, continuing education, micro credentials, micro payments, degrees built out of multiple modules over long periods, mixed online, offline learning, industry partnership, and so forth. And so that idea of the consolidated 3-year degree is probably starting to feel a little obsolete, actually. And I think as we go through the 2020s, and especially as these EdTech platforms, both those that are standalone, the kind of Coursera's and FutureLearns, but also those that are essentially now being run by every university in the land, as they gain traction and gain utility, people will be much more inclined to say, yeah, I'm going to continue learning, for a period of years beyond what you might have termed a conventional degree, or I'm going to spin my degree over 5 years because I'm going to be working as well, and have a much more kind of pick and mix approach to the way they use education, and particularly degrees. I mean, does that resonate with anyone? But it certainly seems to me to be the observation that I'm seeing, is that people are much more likely now to realize that because they'll probably have at least one, if not two, major pivots in their life, they probably need to continue education long beyond the age of 21, for example.
That almost presents us with a bit of a problem, because we know that there are some staff and students that are saying to us now, we're looking forward to things going back to normal. And so there is, with some, there's this need to go back to how things were so that they can feel comfortable. Obviously, the last 12 months has been quite disruptive. I mean, I think we're generally in agreement that we want to now take the best bits of what we've learned over the last 12 months and develop this hybrid approach. But how do we manage the expectations of the staff and students who are sort of craving going back to how things were?
This gets to the heart of university education. I think it gets to the heart of what we're talking about in terms of innovation and how we should approach things. It's fascinating to see in the chat people's comments about this, and it depends how we see university education, because I think there is a worry. People might not necessarily think it is a worry, but we begin to see it as a very instrumental approach. So we begin to see it as something to be gained, and something when you've got, you can move on to the next stage. And of course, that's part of it, but it shouldn't necessarily be seen as a process. I think it should be seen as an experience rather than a process. And I think the danger is, when we're online, is we often miss out that university experience. So I'm absolutely on board when we say we take the best parts of what we've learned over the last year, but I don't think we should just neglect everything else. Leanne, with your agreement, can I bring in Lucy McGraw at this point? Because I know Lucy's done some great stuff with her groups, and I know she's on the call as well. And it'll be interesting to hear how she's created that community and used town halls and so on, if that's all right, and if Lucy's all right to talk.
Yeah, I just don't know whether Lucy's able to talk, actually. The limits of the platform.
Oh, there she is.
Right, okay, Lucy. Welcome, if you are able to.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thank you. Yes, please go.
Am I still there?
Yes, Lucy.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's really interesting to hear, particularly what Alex is saying about the future, because a lot of my students will say, I've got to learn coding. When am I going to learn coding? Because I think I've got to know how to do coding. And I think that's a really interesting thing that we need to think about, because I'm not an IT person, and to me, coding covers a huge range of lots of different skills at varying levels. So that's something I'll definitely want to pick up with Alex again. Some of the things we've been doing, I think, just very, very briefly over the levels, I think, tying in with what's already been said, I think the first years who don't know any different, they have found their own WhatsApp groups, and we've encouraged that at every session. We've encouraged them to share the details, although we haven't actually been part of them. We've left those to be student-led, but they all seem to have managed to find friends and find each other through that. And I think they are in an okay place as they come to the end of their first year. Generally, we did abandon breakout rooms quite early on with them. I think it could have worked if we'd had slightly smaller numbers and more staff. But I think just putting them in breakout room when you've got a cohort online of about 300 and you haven't got sufficient staff to be able to spend a reasonable amount of time, especially with first years with level 4, I just don't think that was going to work. If we'd had more staff resource, then we could have supported them a bit more, but it wasn't going to work with our structure. I think our final years are in a reasonable place, and I think they are already in their friendship groups, which I think has helped a lot because they rely heavily on each other for support. And I think I've noticed that even more because they're talking about missing the library, missing those opportunities to get together. But having said that, they have got used to Teams quickly. They're working on Teams in their groups and setting up their own calls. So I think they're okay. I think second year are the most problematic. I don't know what other people think about that in their institutions, but for me, they've had one and a bit terms face to face, and then the whole of this year online. Some of them have managed to form friendship groups in that first semester of first year, but I feel like they're the ones who have probably slipped away the most across the 3 years. I look after 3 programs. It's nearly 800 students altogether, so it's quite a large number, but they're the ones who I think have probably struggled the most over the last 12 months. A couple of other things that we've done that have worked really well. We've had a big focus in our skills module right at the beginning of first year, and then we picked it up again at the beginning of second year in another skills module. was making sure everybody was comfortable with Zoom, with Teams, with using RVLE. We did spend a lot more time on that. And pushing things like student societies. We've had 3 new societies this year, created and with good engagement, which is so much more than we normally have. And we've been helping the students to get speakers because that's been so much easier online. So that's been a real positive, and there's been nice engagement there, I think, across the levels, because you've got all the levels there together rather than just an individual level. So that's been a big bonus. And I think the whole opportunity to bring in external speakers, we found that so much easier online as well. In fact, we've had weekly external speakers in our town hall slot, and that's just worked really, really well, and we're going to retain that going forward. And just one last thing that a colleague's done recently, which seems to have worked really well. She's done for her final year students a writing boot camp, which she did online, because she said she didn't really feel that she had enough of a handle on how some of them were doing in approaching their final assignments in the last semester of the final year, which was a big piece of work. So she's been running online boot camps. She badged it as a writing retreat and got no sign-ups. She changed the title to boot camp and got a really good number of sign-ups. So I don't think they really understood what a writing retreat was, but that has worked really well, and she's run that in a semi-structured way. So she's going to do a couple more after the spring break. So that's been really positive. She feels like she's much better engagement from that than she would have had if she'd done that in the room. So yeah, just a few things that have worked well for us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne.
Thanks very much. Thank you. It's good to hear. I mean, one of the things that I think's come out today is around that whole piece around student engagement and the very different nature from one student to another. This need to have a sort of human, individualized approach is quite important. I mean, it does sort of take me back actually to the really early work of Gilly Salmon and you know, how do you create online learning communities? And I think one of her really key pieces is about how important it is to establish the social. And perhaps one of the things that we did early in this pandemic was make some assumptions about, you know, the nature of that social environment and that interaction. So I guess we can, in hindsight, see why, you know, just suddenly dumping students in breakout rooms without having done that sort of ice breaking, getting to know each other, developing the community, you know, we can say now that probably a reason why they didn't work so well in the first place. And that then also relates to what you were saying, you know, those students that knew each other before maybe finding it easier to communicate in their sort of less formal WhatsApp groups than those new students that have recently joined us, you know, and not actually being able to communicate. Mark put a question in the chat earlier, which I thought was really good, around that we're making this assumption that all students are actually really keen on being part of their learning experience. And what can we do to support those students who are very passive and actually don't have any interest in being active participants? What are they lost? Do you have any suggestions about how we might be able to engage the passive learners?
Well, it's an interesting point, because you could also segue that with the question that Carol's asked about, she wants a system which she can use, where the academics get the proper level of support to really learn to use the system. And I think if I put the two questions together, it's like, what extra training do academics need to really master these tools such that they can reach out not just to the most engaged and articulate students, but to the more diffident ones? And as we know, there's no correlation at all between how diffident you are and how good you are. So that we might well be losing some of the best students if we're not careful. And I think one thing that I observed is that at the beginning of the pandemic, every academic I knew suddenly had to become a sort of an expert in bespoke video production. and everybody had their own little personal way that they were making their videos, by which they swore, and that they were using some slight twist on the sort of various rather clunky technologies like Panopto that were available. And everybody was filming them in slightly different ways and slightly different backgrounds, and they edited them in various bodged together ways. And it didn't seem to me that there was any overarching system that was being lent to academics to help them deliver high quality material like that. And I think there's probably a degree of work that universities need to do now that the kind of immediate crisis of the pandemic is over, to kind of tool up their online delivery in such a way that it's really relevant to 2020s, including to those students who are more disengaged and perhaps need a little bit more solid outreach than the ones who naturally jump onto a Zoom discussion. And so I think that's a really, really valid point. And I certainly think that from what I've seen, there hasn't yet been a kind of homogeneous technical solution found as to how we create this digital content that we're going to be using in the sort of hybrid world. And that's probably a good opportunity for universities for development.
It's quite interesting to look at the question. I think it's a fascinating question. I don't think I've got any answers other than just to say that I think the more opportunities people have, the better. So, for example, I teach a group of around about 120 on a Thursday. And I know that if I ask a question, I can tell you the names of the people who put something in the chat. You know, it'll be the same ones every single time. But on the other hand, that happens in the classroom when we're face to face. So for me, it's just a case of offering alternatives. So for example, at the end of each of the sessions now, I stay online. I just stay in the main room and just say, if anybody wants to have a chat, then that's great. And what's fascinating is that a different set of people come to chat to me at the end of the session than put things on the chat by the side during the session. I also do some support sessions, drop-in sessions, just to sort of see how people are going. And that's a third set of people. So although I don't get to all 120, I get to a significant number by lots of different methods, and sometimes just relying on email. So for me, I mean, Valerie sort of said about, is there a VLE which does all of these things? And for me, there isn't. So I think you've just got to use lots of different approaches. Somebody else mentioned Padlet, which again I use and is good for some. And it's just going away from the one size fits all and offering people a range of options and seeing what they take up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think learning itself is messy, ambiguous, highly emotional. It can be, it can engage or can put people off quite easily. And I think, again, I think one way to address it, and this is some of the student feedback we've been getting, is consistency is absolutely key. Simplicity, consistency, and accessibility. And if we can address some of those things, we've got a multiplicity of platforms, authentication to get through, all of those kinds of things. If we can remove as many barriers as we possibly can and try to personalize at scale, big asks, I know, but those are the kind of things where people can engage when and how they feel with all of the learning opportunities that we offer. And I think that added to that creativity, that interdisciplinarity, I think should engage more and more people as we go through this. I mean, things like micro-credentializing as well, that kind of thing about sort of just getting some credit where you can for different kinds of activities as well might be a way that we should explore in the future as well.
Thank you. I think one of the other things as well that I guess looking at the chat, some have found frustrating over the last few months is around this communication piece with students. So that sort of staying around after the seminar or lecture would be the point when the students would come and have a chat with you, and you'd have to get out of the room quickly for the next person that's due to join. You could have drop-in office hours. Everything has to be manufactured now to be able to provide those opportunities. But I think one of the things that has also had an impact here is around the support And we all have a huge array of guidance and support available from professional services staff. And it can be really quite frustrating when students are sort of taken to social media or in complaints to say that, you know, they're not being supported, or that, you know, nobody's contacted them, when in fact what we're doing is perhaps not communicating it in the right way, because we know that there's a huge amount of support that's available for them. It's just about, you know, connecting the two. So the emails create a lot of noise. We know that students don't interact using emails. What do you think we could do to better communicate the more holistic support and guidance that are available for students outside of the immediate teaching and the immediate learning that we provide?
Well, I think drop-in hours is a great idea. I think just extending Peter's idea of the end of the class, actually setting certain sort of non-lecture hours aside where people can drop in just for a general chat seems to work really, really well. And that, you know, that inevitably raises topics, you know, which people haven't properly understood and so forth. So creating that extra space, but in a structured way, a kind of office hours approach, but online, can really work, I think.
I think that's true. And what Claire said there, you know, the students seem to have no trouble emailing me. And, you know, I've recently just sent out a round of emails to students where we've been concerned about their attendance, and that their attendance seems to be dropping off. And in the email, it says you need to reply within 5 days. Otherwise, your place at the university could be at risk. You know, all of the students have replied. So they do check their emails. It's just how they're choosing to engage with the communication, with the message that we're sending.
I mean, I find it fascinating, the whole thing. And Leanne, I'm sure you'll be able to sort of fill in the actual numbers, but there was a survey, I think it was last year, before the pandemic hit, about how many emails the average student got from the university every day. And it was something horrendous. Like, you know, they were getting 30 and 40 emails a day. And of course, what happens is that anything that's important does get lost. And, you know, as academics, we know what it's like when you've got an email deluge coming at you. And I think from a student point of view, it's going to be equally as bad. And I think for me, it's about having a communication plan. So making sure that students are aware when communication is coming in, and actually when they need to respond to it. So I mean, we've been trying all sorts of things, and I don't necessarily think we've got the answers, but it's things like making sure that maybe students get a newsletter every week or every fortnight with key points in it. During the day, maybe using things like Teams chat or other chats to contact students, and then you can get to them instantaneously, and also doing some signposting via apps. I think there isn't an easy way of doing it, but it's very easy to do it badly by flooding people. What we need to do is we need to have a plan. If we tell the students this is the plan, then we're a few steps forward.
There's quite a fun chat going on in the chat about how you get students to engage on video, and I've got the age-old problem of the blank screens, which we've all encountered. Just for what it's worth, I'll share my solution, which is do a quiz. If you do a quiz at the top of the lecture, everyone wants to join, everyone wants to be part of a quiz, so they all come on in vision, and then you don't lose everybody. But it is it's quite demoralizing. I mean, I've when you've done a two-hour lecture to 27 blank screens, it's challenging, isn't it? Much harder than doing a 2-hour lecture to 27 people in a room, even if they're not looking at you. So that's something we really need to work on, is trying to create cultural ways for students to proactively switch on and engage even when they're online.
Absolutely. And I think that someone made the point in the chat about it being a leveler as well, that, you know, we talked quite a lot about digital poverty and about turning cameras on and how that might exclude certain groups of students because their home environment. But we have also had some really lovely examples of how students that wouldn't normally have been able to engage have now been able to engage, because they've been able to approach their learning in a more flexible way so that they can fit it around caring responsibilities, around work commitments. So again, I think it's that sort of balance. And Often it's about being transparent with the students as well. So, if I have an email to me where a student's complaining, I always start that conversation with a chat. Let's not just carry on the email backwards and forwards. Let's just have a human conversation. And that usually resolves the issue, and you develop a good relationship with the student as a result of it. But students tend to be craving that transparency, I think. They want to know that they can have that conversation with you, and that you're able to, they're able to actually speak to a human, and, sharing with them our experience as educators as well. So when we say to them, it's really difficult. If we were in a normal seminar and we were having a live conversation, we can read your body language. We can see if you're engaging. We can see if you are struggling with some of the concepts. We can have the opportunity to go back. But if all the cameras are off, it's very hard for us to know where those sticking points might be, and how we might be able to better to support you and do that piece around checking that learning is taking place. I think we might have time for perhaps one more question. There's loads in the chat. There's quite a lot of really, really interesting points that have been raised, which is really fantastic. But I thought I'd just allow the panelists to just perhaps provide a point of summary here. And I wanted to go back to one of David's early points in the webinar today, that technology can't save us. And I thought perhaps you might be able to just maybe reflect on that for a minute or two and just share your thoughts. Is technology the answer? Is that what we're looking for in education?
It's not the answer, it's a question, I think. And we have to wrestle with it, and it's part of who we are now as humans, and we need to find a place for it. But it can't replicate that human contact, that human need to be together. And that's where we probably need things like AI and AR and all of these kind of new technologies that we can embrace to try to make it at least a simulacrum of reality.
I'll jump in for the next one if you like. I think that in terms of the revolution in education created by COVID, to paraphrase Churchill, this is not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. And I think that the whole of the 2020s is going to see education becoming far more deconstructed, more granular, more digital, more modular. And we probably have to just deal with that and start thinking of our universities in much more flexible matrix ways, rather than these kind of cathedral hierarchies that we've hitherto had. And the benefit of that will be concomitant increases in relevancy to students, therefore acceptance of the product and engagement.
I think Alex is right. I suspect that is the future of education. And I actually think that creates great opportunities, but also challenges. Catherine has made the really good point in the chat about how the current situation can help people like carers, commuting students, employed. And I think she's absolutely right. What is missing sometimes, though, is the community and that sort of experience of learning and experience of university. And I think that's what's been lacking in a lot of the solutions when we've moved online. I think for me, it's moving away from almost like a forced community by saying, you will do this, to offering opportunities for students. And I'm quite looking forward to seeing what university life will look like come September and October this year, because I hope, in my optimistic manner, that we've got the best of both worlds. We'll be able to do some face-to-face work, but also we get all of the benefits from using technology and using online learning. And I think in answer to your first question, is technology the answer? I think for me, it's a partial answer, but we need to make sure that the community is there before the technology.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter, David and Alex. I think we've come to the end of our time now, Laura and Brian. If I can hand back to you, if that's okay. Thank you.
You certainly can. Thank you, Leanne. I just wanted to close out the webinar today and just offer some thanks to everyone who's given their time. So thank you first of all to our panel, to Peter, Alex and David for your contributions. Thank you so much, Leanne, for being our chair today. And thank you also, Lucy, for your contribution today. Thank you to everybody who's taken the time to attend and for my colleagues that have helped put the session together today. I just wanted to quickly share some details of how you can keep in touch with us if you would like to following the webinar. So bear with me just a moment. There we go. Hopefully you can now see that. Can anyone see my screen?
Yes, well, I think you can go to the next slide.
Oh, I did. It's gone back. There we go. I do apologise. So if you are interested in reading a bit more about teaching and learning, in particular around the TEF, then Peter and Leanne have published a new book in November, which is hopefully showing for you there. And we're also offering a special promotion code. If anyone would like to get hold of a copy through our website, do feel free. Also, just to flag that this was the first of a series of 4 webinars. We're going to be looking at assessment, at gamification and at internationalisation within higher education over the coming months. So do look out for information about events as we're going forward. So that's it. That's the end of our show today. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be sharing the recording, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I hope you will enjoy the sunshine this afternoon. Thanks once again, everybody, and bye-bye.
Thank you.